Welcome to Lady Killers, a podcast about female serial killers. I am your host, Abraham Archambault. Let's go dig up some bodies. Before we get started with this particular episode of the podcast, as per usual, I need to warn you that this is an explicit podcast. It contains foul language, it contains imagery of murder, sex, incest, you name it. This episode contains it. If any of this stuff is offensive to you, or if you get squeamish and you don't want to hear any of this, please turn off right now and head on over and download some other podcast. This is a true crime podcast, and you all have been warned. Okay, everybody. Hello, everyone out there. Welcome back to the Lady Killers podcast. We were on a little break during the holiday season. We were enjoying some time off with family and friends. I hope all of you out there did the same and were able to do that and spend some precious time with your loved ones. Since we've been gone, one announcement has come through regarding my screenplay, Loon Lake, and that is that it was accepted into the Hollywood Art and Film Awards down in Santa Monica, California. That is the final festival that I actually submitted Loon Lake to, so no more news will be coming in for that. But also, in just a week, I will be heading down to Arizona for the Chandler International Film Festival just outside Phoenix. Loon Lake was one of the screenplays that was selected for a table read by some of the actors that are going to be present at the festival. By it also being read at the table, it also means that Loon Lake is nominated for an award for screenplay. So fingers crossed on that one. Pretty excited about that. And it should be a fun time when I get down to Arizona next week. I will keep you all up to date on how the festival goes. Hopefully I can update you while I'm there. And I'm trying to do another episode while I'm down there. And hopefully it'll be somebody, one of the lady killers from Arizona would be nice. Like I did in Idaho when I was there for the Twin Falls Festival. And so I'd like to pick somebody that is from Arizona. If anybody out there, if you know any good lady killers from Arizona, feel free to shoot me an email over at 1129productions@gmail.com. Or you can also visit the website at 1129productions.com. Just let us know about any Arizona killers you'd like to hear more about. And also for that podcast, it's looking like I might have my first guest appearances. One or two people might be able to be on that. That'll be exciting, so stay tuned for that. My screenplay, Loon Lake, all of this fun activity surrounding it as we're developing it and we're in pre-production. It's really cruising along pretty quickly. I've got actors secured. I've got some investors that continue to roll in as the weeks go by. And it truly looks like we will be all good to start shooting this film in the springtime. But Loon Lake, my screenplay, it is available still on Amazon. So if you want to read the script before the film comes out, head on over to Amazon and check it out. It is available on paperback, or it's also available for a Kindle download. If you love horror, suspense, thrillers, check it out. But enough of this self-promotion and all this great news I have rolling in. Let's just dive right into this week's episode of Lady Killers. This week we are heading down south again, and we're settling on the muggy state of Florida. Any followers of serial killers or true crime out there will know this person without a doubt instantly when you hear the name. Her life was made into a movie back in 2003, which garnered Charlize Theron's Oscar for her portrayal of this Floridian. Her murders have been documented numerous times on television, in books, and different true crime and serial killer shows out there have told the story. She is one of the most famous female serial killers on this planet. And since we know so much about this woman and we have so much information to pour over here, I've decided to break this into a two-parter. So this will be your first part. I almost didn't even want to do this lady killer just because of it's almost too obvious for the state of Florida. You know, I was hoping to find another murderer in the state, one that's not as widely known, but they're way too known down there. Casey Anthony, for instance. She's not a serial killer. She is a horrible murderer, though. But in this case, how could I pass up the opportunity to speak about this lady killer for the week? And her name's synonymous with serial murder. She's the queen when it comes to serial killing women. So I did end up selecting her this week. And this week we'll begin part one of the story that you've all been waiting for. This week, we slip into the twisted mind of Aileen Wuornos. She was born Aileen Carol Pittman in Troy, Michigan on February 29th, 1956. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was merely 14 years old when she married Aileen's father, Leo, who was only 16 years old at the time. Now, right off the bat, here we go. We got a clear case of kids having kids. You know, it's just a wonder any of us even survived way back in those old 1900s. The couple were wed in June of 1954 and gave birth to Aileen's brother Keith in March of the following year. Aileen wouldn't show up until about a year after that, but by that time, the parents had actually already divorced. Not only were they divorced, but it came out that Aileen's father, Leo, was in jail at the time of her birth because of, he ended up being a convicted child sex offender. And so he was in and out of mental institutes. He was diagnosed schizophrenic. And Aileen would never even meet him. Out of all the things that were in Aileen's troubled life, this is probably one of the good things in her life that she never actually got to meet her own father. As I said, he was a child molester, and he would basically be locked up for his entire life due to the fact that he was schizophrenic and he was a pedophile. He eventually would commit suicide in 1969. And to add to this, her mother Diane also abandoned her and her brother Keith, basically dropped him off at the grandparents' house and said, "I'm out of here. See you later. I don't want to raise kids anymore. I don't want to be a mother." And so they were left with the grandparents. It was Diane's parents. And they would legally adopt Aileen and Keith later that year. So there you have the start of this young girl's life. A schizophrenic father who diddled kids, and he would wind up, killing himself. And then a mother who didn't even want her own kids, who dropped him off and basically went off to live her own life and left them with her parents. It just gets us thinking right here, right at the beginning, and we always wonder about how these serial killers start. How were these monsters created? There you go. Schizophrenic pedophile father and a mother who didn't want them. By the time Aileen was 11 years old, she was already engaging in sexual activity at her school. She would perform various sexual acts in exchange for food, cigarettes, or drugs. Right there, that's strike one, 11 years old. It was also known that she engaged in some of these activities with her own brother Keith. So sleeping with her brother at the age of 11, strike two. Also, by this time in her life, she claimed that she had already been abused sexually by her alcoholic grandfather, and he was supposed to be some sort of father figure. They adopted those kids. he should have been the father. But as she told later on in her life, this drunk grandpa was raping her. Not only was she being sexually abused, but this sadistic grandfather, he would just beat her viciously. After making her strip off all of her clothes, he would just beat her to the point of where she couldn't even move. I would say that's strike three, and it definitely sent Aileen onto her path of death and destruction. I don't see how any child could even emerge from this upbringing and then be expected to walk down a straight and narrow path. It's just not going to happen. By the time Aileen was 14 years old, she was already pregnant. Like her mom, at the same time, she was 14 when she was basically already ready to marry Eileen's father. So passing it on, just like it used to be back there, kids having kids. But in this particular case, she said this pregnancy was due to the fact that she was raped by one of her grandfather's friends. I use that term loosely. One of these guys who would frequently visit the grandfather, and they would just pass her around and use her up like a piece of meat. And it's just so disgusting to think about how they treated this girl, 14 years old, pregnant. What do you do at that point? In Eileen's case, the pregnancy went to term, and a baby boy was born on March 23rd, 1971, in a home for unwed mothers. Now, the baby was immediately snatched away and given up for adoption because they said Aileen was not fit to raise a child of her own at that age, which I totally agree. I don't think a 14-year-old should be trying to raise a baby. And within that next year, Aileen, she would drop out of school. And that was shortly after she gave birth to that child. She would also lose her grandmother to liver failure. And she would be kicked out of the house by her evil grandfather. Now, this led Aileen to pick up the oldest trade in our country, prostitution. She would hook to survive, and she lived in the nearby woods, close to her old home. And it's just not quite what we imagine our life to be when we're 15 years old. We want to be hanging out with friends at the mall or, playing video games, whatever. She's a sex worker at the age of 15. But that's what happens when you're raised by animals that treat you as if you're just a worthless plaything and you're only good for one activity. In May of 1974, Aileen, at the age of 18, was arrested in Colorado for driving under the influence. In addition to the charge of drunk driving, she was also charged with disorderly conduct because she was firing a weapon from a moving vehicle. So, driving drunk around and just shooting off your gun out the window. Nice little joyride she had going on there, but she was popped and she was arrested. And she didn't really give a shit about law, about consequences of her actions. So she never appeared for that court date she was supposed to. So then she was charged with failure to appear. She was quickly racing down this terrible path. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/ladykillers. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. For all you listeners of the Lady Killers podcast, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. I've really been on an Audible tear lately, just listening to everything I can get my hands on. And the latest listen I had was one of my favorite baseball players as a child growing up was Lenny Dykstra. And he's got a book out about his life entitled House of Nails. And let me tell you, this does not disappoint. I always knew he was a wild man on and off the field, and this audiobook confirms that. Even more than I could possibly dream of. And I know that's totally unrelated to this particular podcast, but that's the beauty of Audible. They have everything from every genre that you can choose. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/ladykillers. Again, that's audibletrial.com/ladykillers for your free audiobook. A couple years later, Eileen was hitchhiking down a highway in Florida when she was picked up by a president of the local yacht club, a 69-year-old man by the name of Louis Gratz Fell. They immediately fell madly in love, and they announced their impending nuptials in the local paper, and they were soon married. You would think that this would cause Eileen to clean up her act, start living some sort of charmed life with her new rich husband, but that's not even close. She, you can't take that wild animal. No matter what you try to do, you can throw money at it, you can try to solve these problems, but, this animal was created by her horrible upbringing. So she continued to act up in the bars and taverns around town. She would get into fights on the regular. And, it would lead to her arrest on occasion for assault and battery of different people. And then within weeks of being married to Lewis, Eileen was accused of hitting her husband on the head with his own cane. So he went down and he obtained a restraining order against Eileen. And this sent her racing away back to her home state of Michigan. Upon returning to Michigan, she was promptly arrested on July 14th, 1976 in Antrim County, and she was charged with assault yet again and disturbing the peace. Apparently, she had thrown a pool cue at a bartender's head, and he pressed charges and she was arrested. It's just this wild side of her with the assaults and all the violence. It's like I said, it was ingrained. It was something that was basically beat into her as she was a young child. And 3 days after that particular incident, her brother Keith passed away from cancer. Eileen inherited 10 grand from this death of her brother from his life insurance policy. So with this money, Eileen annulled her marriage to Louis Gratz Fell, and that was only after about 9 weeks of marriage. And then shortly after that, Eileen was once again cited for drunk driving. The old go-to move for Eileen there. She used up all of her brother's insurance money to pay for the court fees and all the fines associated with that. But she also decided to purchase a new fancy car and some other luxuries. And not long after she purchased this fancy luxury car, she crashed and wrecked it and totaled it. So it's no big surprise since she was driving around drunk everywhere she went, flashing her gun everywhere she went. So, this was just all these petty crimes she was committing. It seemed normal for her. That's just how somebody was supposed to live. But this really was going to be one of her last petty crimes that Eileen committed before she decided to graduate to more severe criminal activity. On May 20th, 1981, Eileen was arrested for armed robbery down in Edgewater, Florida. She was popped for robbing a convenience store. Now, the score from that robbery was $35 and 2 packs of cigarettes. For that measly score, she spent just over a year in prison, and she wasn't released until June 30th, 1983. And then just shy of a year later, Eileen was arrested once again. This time it was for forging checks and attempting to use them down in Key West. That was May of 1984. In November of 1985, she was fingered as the main suspect in the theft of a gun and its ammo down in Pasco County, Florida. 2 months later, in January of '86, Aileen Wuornos was arrested in Miami. This time, she was charged with theft of a vehicle, resisting arrest, and obstruction of justice because she had used her aunt's ID when she was stopped and asked by the police for all of her information. She tried to pass herself off as her aunt, so she was also cited for that. But then, while the officers were doing a search of the stolen vehicle, they found a .38 revolver along with a box of bullets, and so she was taken in for that as well. Just a few months later, in Volusia County, Deputies detained Aileen Wuornos because the male companion she was rolling with at the time accused her of pulling a gun on him and demanding that he pay $200 to her. When they eventually searched Aileen in this case, she was found with a bunch of extra ammo, as well as a .22 pistol sitting under the passenger seat where she was riding in. So Eileen's just spinning out of control. As I said before, she had no respect for the law. Any consequences that would come from her actions, she didn't even think about. It was all impulse. She was drinking all the time, flashing weapons. Of course, she's going to get popped constantly by the police, which is what happened. Now, a lot of you might be thinking right now, what's this guy doing? Is he just going to run down the list of all of her petty crimes and burglaries and all the stupid shit that Aileen was into at the time? You might be thinking, oh, big deal. This lady's a petty criminal running around with the wrong crowd. She had a rough childhood. She was abused. So of course she turned to a life of crime. Of course she would be a sex worker after being raped and abused by her grandfather and his friends. I mean, this is lady killers, for God's sake. Where is the killer in this story? Oh, just you wait, my friends. Aileen Wuornos is about to turn from mysterious drifter and petty thief to one of the country's vilest killers in all of history. Aileen Wuornos had a horrible upbringing. She was sexually abused from an early age, and she ended up turning to prostitution just to make ends meet. And she seemed to be treated the worst by the men that she came into contact in her life. And, all the way from her pedophile grandfather down to, having sexual relations with her own brother, it's just these men in her life treated her horribly. It seemed like she was always being abused by these men and being controlled by these men in her life, and I think she was getting fed up with that. So when she met Tyria Moore, her world finally opened up to love. The two met at a Daytona Beach lesbian bar, and they hit it off right away, and they decided to move in together. At that time, Tyria was working as a maid, and Aileen was a sex worker, as I had mentioned before. But Aileen convinced Tyria to stay at home and be a stay-at-home wife while Aileen would go out and make all the money so they could live. And this living, if you want to call it that, was as a sex worker. So as she's out, being a prostitute, Tyria sitting at home, being the good wife, waiting for her to return. Now these two, they had a grand and wild time together. They would hop between bars, wreaking havoc wherever they set foot. And then on July 4th, 1987, Daytona Beach police had to detain Wuornos and her girlfriend after it was reported that the two had caused a fight at the bar. They were accused of battery and assault with a beer bottle during one of these wild fights that they had. Now, the following year in March, Aileen was involved in another assault, but this time it was the other way around. She was the one that was doing the alleging. She claimed that a bus driver in Daytona Beach had assaulted her by pushing her off of the bus after they had a brief scuffle on board. Tyria Moore was present during the altercation, so she was listed as a witness. She was always by Eileen's side. It seemed like the two were just so much in love, inseparable. And Wuornos, actually, she would go on to say that Tyria was the love of her life and that she was madly in love with her basically since the day she met her all the way until her death. And this relationship, it was the second time Aileen had dated another woman. It is unclear whether she preferred women over men, but it is known that her clients as a sex worker were mostly middle-aged white men from the lower class. Now, it's just simply how she made her money, though. I don't judge people for being sex workers. We do what we have to do to make money and to survive. It's the way these men treated her, which is shitty and unacceptable, that basically it caused her to be the monster that she ended up being. That was her job, though, as a sex worker, and that has nothing to do with her personal or romantic life. But it is during these times with these white men, these crazy white men, that her hatred grew and grew towards men. And it's just a hatred that grew by the way that she had always been treated by men throughout her life. And as Aileen was turning tricks, making her money that way, she would steal a little bit from them, little petty thieves like she had always done, but she would take certain things from her Johns. Tyria was also stealing items on the side for them, and they would both compile all these items they were stealing from people, and they would take them to local pawn shops, and they would sell them to make ends meet. That's how we make money, Some people, they become desperate, and they do what they can to survive. But in this case, the act of reselling these items back to pawn shops would backfire later on as they were selling these items to the local pawn shops. This is the act that would actually finally backfire later on in Eileen's career, and it would catch up with her and lead authorities straight to her. So this concludes part 1 of the Aileen Wuornos episode. I hope you're all gathering all the information that you need to know about this lady killer. I really hope that you will join me next week to find out exactly what Miss Wuornos did to make our lady killers list. But I do want to thank you again for listening. If you would like to support this podcast, please visit the link in the notes for this episode, and please contribute in whatever way you can. If not, please continue to listen entirely for free. Share it with any people that you know that might be interested in true crime or serial killers. Again, my screenplay, Loon Lake, it's available for purchase and download at Amazon.com. If you're into thrillers, if you're into horror, slasher, this screenplay is right up your alley. Read it now before the film comes out later this year. Please visit 1129productions.com and leave any questions or comments that you have in regards to the podcast or just anything else in general. Again, thanks for listening. I am your host, Abraham Archambault. I hope you have sweet dreams.